He was charming. He was polite. And he killed for fun. Women vanished without a trace. Days later, their bodies were found discarded like they never mattered. No one saw him coming. No one believed the truth. And by the time they did, it was already too late. This is the story of Nigeria's most ruthless serial killer, Jack Kell. A man who hunted for pleasure and left terror in his wake. Stay with me as we uncover the horrifying truth. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Jack Kell was born in Lagos, Nigeria, in the 1980s. To most, he was just another child, quiet, reserved, unremarkable. But beneath that surface, something else was growing. Something no one noticed until it was too late. His family was ordinary. A working father. A caring mother. Neighbors who greeted him with warm smiles. But Jack was different. He didn't laugh like the other children. He didn't cry when he got hurt. And when something died in front of him, he didn't look away. He watched. As a teenager, the signs became harder to ignore. Stray animals turned up dead. Small creatures, birds, cats, even dogs, mutilated with an eerie precision. But there were no witnesses. No evidence. Just lifeless bodies discarded in alleys and gutters. And every time his mother asked if he had seen anything, Jack would smile and shake his head. He learned quickly. Learned how to hide what he was. How to blend in. How to charm. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had mastered the art of deception. A polite young man, well-spoken, helpful. No one suspected a thing. Not yet. But beneath the mask, the hunger was growing. The thrill of small kills no longer satisfied him. He needed more. He needed the real thing. And when he finally took his first life, it was only the beginning. It was a warm evening in Lagos, 2005, when 21-year-old Sophia Williams finished her evening classes and decided to head home. She had spoken to her roommate just minutes before, telling her she would be back soon. But Sophia never made it home. Her phone went silent. Her social media went dark. Her friends assumed she had gotten caught up with something, maybe stayed at a friend's place or lost track of time. But as the hours stretched into days, an uneasy dread began to creep in. Her family reported her missing, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the police might take it seriously. But in a city filled with crime, disappearances were not uncommon, especially for young women. They asked a few questions, took a few notes, and then, just like that, the case was shelved. It wasn't until 5 days later that Sophia's body was found, buried in a shallow grave on the outskirts of Lagos. A group of children playing in the fields had stumbled upon something unusual, something half-buried, something that didn't belong. At first, they thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes, torn and covered in dirt. But then, one of them saw a hand, its fingers curled, frozen in place. Screams filled the air, and soon the police were called. When they arrived, they uncovered what was left of Sophia. Her body had been mutilated beyond recognition, her face unrecognizable, as if the killer had wanted to erase her identity entirely. The only thing that remained untouched was the small silver ring on her left hand, the same ring her mother had given her on her 18th birthday. That ring was the only way they knew it was her. But despite the gruesome nature of the crime, the case was quickly dismissed as an isolated incident, another tragic but random act of violence in a city where such things happened far too often. Sophia was mourned, her family shattered, but the world moved on. The authorities did not suspect that her killer was just getting started. Over the next few months, more women began to vanish. They were students, secretaries, shop assistants. Some were last seen waiting for a taxi. Others were leaving work late at night. Some had told their friends they would be back soon. But none of them ever returned. The city whispered about the disappearances, but without a connection, without a clear suspect, the cases remained open, collecting dust in forgotten folders. The police saw them as unrelated, a string of unfortunate coincidences. They didn't see the invisible thread tying them all together. They didn't know that a single man was hunting them, stalking them, playing a sick and twisted game. That man was Jack Kell. Unlike most killers, Jack didn't fit the profile of a desperate or reckless murderer. He wasn't sloppy. He didn't lash out in a fit of rage. He was patient. Calculated. He knew exactly how to make his victims trust him. He was charming, well-spoken, and, most importantly, he understood how to blend in. He dressed well, carried himself like a man of status, and presented himself as a successful businessman, someone who could offer his victims something. A job opportunity. A connection. A safe ride home. He knew what they wanted to hear, and he made sure to say it. And once they let their guard down, once they believed they were safe, that's when he made his move. Jack's methods were as meticulous as they were brutal. He didn't rush. He didn't act on impulse. He planned everything, the way he approached them, the way he isolated them, the way he ensured there would be no witnesses. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted control. He wanted to see the life drain from their eyes, to feel the power of knowing that he alone decided their fate. And when it was over, when his victims were no longer breathing, he discarded them like they were nothing, burying them in unmarked graves, erasing them from the world as if they had never existed at all. But no matter how careful Jack was, no matter how many times he covered his tracks, there was one thing he didn't account for: patterns. And slowly, without even realizing it, he was leaving one behind. The similarities between the victims were impossible to ignore. They were all young. They were all ambitious. They were all trusting. And one by one, they had all fallen into the hands of the same man. But the police still weren't looking. They still didn't see the truth. And that mistake would cost even more lives. Jack Kell had refined his craft, perfected his deception. He was a ghost, slipping through the cracks of the system, always staying one step ahead. But the authorities were about to make a discovery that would send shockwaves through the city, a discovery that would finally reveal just how deep his darkness truly ran. And by the time they put the pieces together, the body count was far higher than anyone could have imagined. As time goes on, Jack took the killing to the next level. It started with whispers, women disappearing, one after another. At first, no one made the connection. A missed call here, an unanswered text there. Friends assumed they had been too busy. Families waited, expecting their loved ones to walk through the door at any moment. But as days turned to weeks and the silence deepened, fear took root. Mrs. Kelvin, a mother of 3, filed a police report for her eldest daughter, Juliet Kelvin, who had never failed to check in. Daniel Jackson, a worried father, searched the streets for his missing youngest, Amy Daniel, calling out her name in the dead of night. Desperation clung to his voice as he pleaded with anyone who would listen. And yet, Lagos moved on, the streets just as crowded, the markets just as loud, unaware that something truly monstrous was unfolding in its midst. The police weren't prepared for what they would eventually uncover. They treated the cases as isolated incidents, dismissing them as runaways or crimes of opportunity. After all, in a city as vast and chaotic as Lagos, people disappeared all the time. Some left for better opportunities. Some wanted to escape troubled homes. Some simply got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the bodies told a different story. When the remains of Charity Desmond, a bright, ambitious university student, were found dumped in a remote clearing, the brutality was undeniable. She had suffered. She had been restrained, tortured, and discarded like she was nothing. Her family could barely recognize what was left of her. The details were too specific, the cruelty too deliberate. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated. It was ritualistic. And it had only just begun. Jack Kell knew exactly what he was doing. He had mastered the art of deception, charming, composed, always blending in. To the outside world, he was a successful young businessman, the kind of man people admired. He had a confident stride, an easy smile, a warmth that put people at ease. He lured his victims with the ease of a seasoned predator, offering rides, buying drinks, flashing just enough wealth to make them believe he was safe. But safety was an illusion. By the time they realized who he truly was, it was already too late. Each disappearance followed a pattern: young, ambitious women, full of life, completely unaware that their fate had already been sealed the moment they crossed his path. And with each new victim, he grew more confident, more untouchable. He was playing a game only he understood, and the entire city had become his hunting ground. Detective Mike Smith and his team struggled to make sense of it. The women had no known connections to one another. There were no obvious ties, no singular place where they had all crossed paths. And Jack? He was careful. He left no traces, no clues that could lead back to him. He operated in the gaps, in the blind spots of a system too slow to react. He followed the cases in the news, taking note of how authorities responded. He adapted, changed his methods, stayed one step ahead. And while detectives sifted through evidence, trying to piece together a case that made no sense, another woman vanished. Doris Duke, a 24-year-old aspiring fashion designer, left home one evening and was never seen again. Then it was Faith Benson, a bank teller who had just gotten engaged. Then Nellie Nelson, a newlywed who had simply gone out to buy groceries. One by one, they disappeared, swallowed by the city. Psychologists later dissected his mind, searching for the moment he crossed the line from a seemingly ordinary man to something unrecognizable. But there was no single moment. No tragic backstory, no clear explanation for why he became the way he was. He lacked empathy from the start, manipulating those around him with ease. The idea of suffering fascinated him. The sight of fear exhilarated him. He didn't just kill, he made his victims beg, made them feel utterly powerless before taking their lives. And when it was over, he walked away untouched, ready for the next one. He craved that control, that moment where another human being realized they were entirely at his mercy. It was never about anger, never about revenge. It was about the power, the feeling of being a god in those final moments. One woman lived to tell the tale. Blessing Henry came forward months later, her voice unsteady as she described the night she met Jack Kell. He had been charming, his words smooth, his demeanor inviting. She hadn't thought twice when he offered her a ride. Why would she? Nothing about him seemed dangerous. But the moment the door closed behind her, the air changed. The warmth in his eyes vanished. And then, in a voice so disturbingly calm, he told her about the perfect kill. She had never heard something so chilling, so devoid of humanity. She knew, in that moment, that she wasn't meant to leave that room alive. She had run. She didn't know how she made it out, only that she did. Maybe it was luck. Maybe something had disrupted his plan. Maybe, just maybe, he had let her go to see what she would do. But as she recounted her escape, one thing was clear: he had done this before. And if no one stopped him, he would do it again. She pleaded with the authorities to believe her, to listen, to act. But by then, Jack Kell had already vanished into the night, blending back into the crowd like a ghost. Lagos was now a city held hostage by fear. The missing posters multiplied. Women looked over their shoulders. Families waited for news they already knew would be grim. The tension was suffocating, the kind that seeped into everyday life. Parents kept their daughters indoors. The nightlife, once vibrant, dimmed as the city's women grew wary of strangers, of familiar faces, of even the most mundane interactions. And yet, despite the fear, Jack Kell remained elusive. Detective Mike Smith pushed harder, combing through evidence, desperate to make a breakthrough. His team worked around the clock, reviewing every missing persons report, every unsolved homicide, and every detail that might lead them to the man behind it all. And still, Jack Kell walked free, watching, waiting, choosing his next victim. The city wanted answers. The police wanted justice. The families wanted closure. But Jack? He wanted something else entirely. He wanted to perfect his craft. He wanted to push further, to test the limits of what he could get away with. He was careful, patient, always in control. He watched as the police struggled, as the city held its breath, as fear tightened its grip around Lagos like a vice. And then, as if daring them to catch him, he struck again. The police were closing in, but the question remained, would they catch him before he struck again? For years, Jack Kell had hunted in the shadows, slipping through the cracks of an investigation that had, for far too long, been one step behind him. He had honed his methods to perfection. Carefully selecting his victims, meticulously covering his tracks, and ensuring that nothing, not a single shred of evidence, could ever directly tie him to the growing number of bodies being unearthed in shallow graves across Lagos. His ability to blend in, to play the role of the charismatic businessman, the kind stranger, the perfect gentleman, had kept him untouchable. His killings were methodical, his approach disturbingly calculated, and even as the whispers of a serial predator lurking in the city spread fear among women, Jack remained confident, convinced that the police would never catch him. But no matter how careful a killer is, no matter how skilled they are at deception, there is always one mistake, one misstep that will bring everything crashing down. For Jack Kell, that mistake was Sarah Austin. Sarah was not just another nameless victim, not another woman whose disappearance would fade into the endless cycle of unsolved cases. She was different. She was smart, cautious, and, most importantly, deeply connected to law enforcement. She was the niece of Inspector Dave Austin, one of the most experienced officers on the force, and when she failed to return home that night, her absence did not go unnoticed. Unlike the countless other women who had fallen into Jack's trap, whose cases had been dismissed as random disappearances, Sarah's case triggered an immediate and relentless response. Within hours, an emergency task force was assembled, every officer briefed, every available resource dedicated to finding her. Time was crucial, and for the first time, Jack had no idea that his latest victim had set in motion a series of events that would finally expose him for the monster he was. As detectives combed through the last known locations of Sarah, they uncovered a critical piece of evidence that would change everything: CCTV footage from a bar in Victoria Island. The footage, though grainy and distorted by poor lighting, captured a chilling sequence of events. Sarah, dressed in a red dress, was seen chatting with a tall, well-dressed man at the bar. His posture was relaxed, his gestures smooth, his smile confident. The timestamp showed that they had spoken for nearly an hour before she followed him outside. The camera, positioned at an unfortunate angle, barely managed to catch the moment she got into his sleek black car. But what made the footage truly damning was the moment investigators paused the video and zoomed in. The man's face, though partially shadowed, was unmistakable. Jack Kell had finally been caught on camera. With this newfound lead, the police wasted no time. A search warrant was immediately secured, and before sunrise, a tactical unit was assembled. Jack had always been one step ahead, but this time, the authorities would not give him the chance to slip away. At precisely 4:37 a.m., a convoy of police vehicles silently approached his luxury apartment in Ikoyi, their lights off, their weapons ready. The team expected resistance. A desperate man cornered by law enforcement was always the most dangerous kind, and they had prepared for a violent confrontation. But when they finally breached his door, what they found inside was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The moment the officers stepped inside, an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. The apartment was immaculately arranged, eerily pristine, as if it had been staged to perfection. But the deeper they searched, the more they uncovered the grotesque reality hidden beneath the surface. Inside his closet, neatly folded, were blood-stained clothing, some belonging to women who had been reported missing months, even years earlier. DNA analysis would later confirm that the blood on those garments belonged to at least 7 different victims. On his desk, next to an old-fashioned typewriter, lay an aged, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten confessions. Every detail was meticulously recorded: names, locations, descriptions of his victims' final moments. It was a diary of death, a personal manifesto of his twisted desires, written not with guilt, but with the cold detachment of a man who saw murder as nothing more than an intellectual exercise. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, an open laptop sat on a desk, its screen casting an eerie glow. What was on that laptop would make even the most seasoned detectives recoil in horror. One by one, officers clicked through the files stored on the device, their expressions shifting from shock to sheer disbelief. Videos. Dozens of them. Each file named with a single word, a chilling code that only Jack understood. As they pressed play, the horror unfolded before their eyes, footage of women, bound, terrified, pleading for their lives. Their cries filled the silent room, their terror frozen in time, recorded for one purpose alone: Jack's own sick pleasure. The sheer scale of his depravity became undeniable, his complete lack of remorse horrifying beyond comprehension. Officers, men who had witnessed the worst of humanity in their careers, found themselves turning away, unable to watch. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others clenched their fists, suppressing the rage that burned inside them. And then, amid the horror, stood Jack Kell himself. He had not run. He had not hidden. He had not even attempted to destroy the evidence that would seal his fate. Instead, he stood in the dimly lit hallway, his hands raised, a smirk barely concealed on his lips, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. When officers handcuffed him and led him out of the building, he did not resist. He did not scream, did not curse, did not show a single sign of fear. Instead, he walked calmly, almost leisurely, as if he were simply taking a late-night stroll. And as the flashing lights of news cameras illuminated his face, as reporters shouted questions, as the world finally saw the face of the man who had haunted the city for years, he did something that sent chills through every witness present: he smiled. A slow, deliberate, unnerving smile that stretched across his face like a silent taunt. And then, in a voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather, he uttered the words that would forever be burned into history: "I just wanted to see how long I could get away with it." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, a sea of anxious faces watching as Jack Kell was finally forced to answer for the horrors he had inflicted upon so many. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with grief, anger, and the quiet, desperate hope that justice would be served. Survivors of his sadistic crimes sat in rigid silence, their hands gripping the arms of their chairs so tightly their knuckles turned white. Families of the victims clutched framed photographs of their loved ones, their eyes hollow from years of mourning, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and rage. Court officers stood like statues, their faces betraying no emotion, but even they could feel the weight of what was unfolding. And then, there was Jack Kell. Sitting at the defense table as though none of this concerned him in the slightest, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed, his lips curving ever so slightly into something that might have been amusement. Even with the chains binding his hands, even with the evidence stacked against him, even with the knowledge that he was moments away from hearing his fate, he looked like a man who believed he had already won. One by one, the survivors stepped forward to testify, their voices unsteady but their words unwavering as they recounted the unspeakable horrors they had endured. A woman who had barely escaped his clutches described in agonizing detail the moment she realized the charming man who had invited her into his car was something far worse than he appeared, how his demeanor shifted the second she was alone with him, how his voice turned cold, detached, inhuman. She described the way he whispered about the perfect kill as though he was an artist, as though her life meant nothing more than another piece in his twisted gallery of death. Family members of the murdered spoke next, their testimonies raw with emotion, their grief still fresh even after all these years. A mother trembled as she held up a photograph of her daughter, the bright, smiling young woman whose life had been brutally cut short at Jack's hands. A father clenched his fists as he spoke of the sleepless nights spent wondering if his daughter had suffered, if she had begged, if she had known in those final moments that help would never come. And yet, through all of it, through every tear shed, every voice that cracked under the weight of their pain, Jack Kell remained unmoved. He listened with eerie calm, his gaze flitting from witness to witness as if their suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience, as if he was simply waiting for the moment when he could finally stand and walk away. But this time, there would be no walking away. The prosecution laid out their case with brutal efficiency, presenting the jury with overwhelming evidence of Jack Kell's monstrous crimes. The blood-stained clothing found in his apartment. The journal, filled with chilling descriptions of his murders, written with a level of detail so grotesque it made the courtroom shudder. The videos, the ones he had filmed himself, each one showing a different victim, each one capturing the moment he took a life with cold, meticulous precision. The footage was played for the jury, and as the muffled screams echoed through the silent courtroom, several people looked away, unable to stomach the sight. A few had to rush out, hands clamped over their mouths, their faces pale with horror. But Jack Kell? He did not flinch. He did not blink. If anything, he looked entertained. When the judge finally spoke, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty, on all counts. Guilty, of every murder. Guilty, of being the monster that had haunted a nation. And then, the sentence was handed down, death. The words should have felt like a victory, like justice finally being served. And yet, as the courtroom sat in stunned silence, something still felt terribly wrong. Even as he was led away, even as the chains around his wrists rattled with every step he took, Jack Kell smiled. It was not the smile of a man who had been defeated. It was not the expression of someone who had lost. It was something far more unsettling. Because Jack Kell had never cared about getting caught. He had never cared about punishment, or guilt, or remorse. He had already gotten exactly what he wanted. The fear. The legend. The knowledge that long after he was gone, his name would still send shivers down the spines of those who heard it. And then, in the weeks following his sentencing, the rumors began. Had he truly worked alone? Some investigators swore there were details that didn't add up, that his method suggested he had been taught, that someone had been watching, learning. Had all his victims been found? Some believed there were bodies still buried in places that no one had thought to search. And the most chilling theory of all? That Jack Kell was not an anomaly, but a warning. That for every one monster who gets caught, there are others who never do. Others who walk the streets unnoticed, others who blend into the crowds, watching, waiting. And that leads to the question that should haunt us all: do you believe we've truly seen the last of killers like Jack Kell? Or are there others already out there, waiting for their moment to strike? As the chilling case of Jack Kell comes to a close, one question lingers in the minds of all who have followed his terrifying story: was justice truly served, or does the darkness he left behind still linger in ways we may never fully understand? His crimes shook an entire city to its core, his reign of terror leaving scars that may never fully heal. The survivors, the grieving families, and the investigators who tirelessly worked to bring him down will never forget the horrors they uncovered, the lives that were lost, or the unsettling possibility that Jack Kell may not have been the only predator lurking in the shadows. But now, we turn to you, the audience. Did this case shock you? Do you believe justice was fully served, or do you think there are still unanswered questions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if there's another case that has haunted your mind, one that you'd like us to uncover in chilling detail, let us know which true crime story we should investigate next. If you believe that justice was done and that monsters like Jack Kell should never be forgotten, hit that like button, because every time we shine a light on cases like this, we ensure that the victims' voices continue to be heard. And if you crave more of these unsettling deep dives into the darkest corners of the human psyche, then you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay safe, stay curious, and don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that are absolutely real.